going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm making a video posing the question, how do I choose a competitive deck? I get messages from you guys all the time from newer players, from players that are casual players, maybe wanting to get into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, and maybe even former competitive players wanting to jump back in the midst of the game because they're looking for, that springboard, or really they're just looking for a starting point because since Yu-Gi-Oh can evolve so rapidly, and especially when it comes to competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, it is vastly different than casual Yu-Gi-Oh! There's a lot more factors you need to consider that I wanted to make this video as a foundation for anyone looking to jump into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! So we're going to be posing 5 questions that you should consider when it comes to any deck that you want to consider playing competitively. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Miguel, to James, as well as Sawyer. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So the first question you should ask yourself is, can my deck beat Pendulum Magician? And can your deck beat Pendulum Magician consistently? Now this question is specifically going to be catered towards this specific format at the time of recording this video in March of 2018, because there are specific questions that you should be asking yourself about the format, because in this instance, Pendulum Magician has solidified itself as the best deck of this format based off of plenty of regional and YCS tournament results, so it's going to be the deck to beat, which means it's going to have the highest representation. So statistically, at any high tier event you might be attending, the chances are you're going to play that deck more than any other deck in the field. Now you might not, but statistically speaking, the chances are in favor that you will. Now again, this is specifically catered to this meta, and I want you to remember that these are the questions that you want to ask yourself when it comes to any specific best deck of any given format, because if you're playing a deck and you have a difficult time handling your Pendulum Magician matchup, you probably shouldn't play that deck, because since statistically speaking, you're going to be playing that deck more than any other deck, especially once you get to the higher tiers of the tournament, when you're getting into rounds 10, 11, 12, or even the top cut of a YCS, that's where you're really going to start seeing the best decks more often. So in this instance with Pendulum Magician, if you have a difficult time, it might not be the best deck for you to play. Now this moves us on to our second question. How consistently can your deck out Masterpiece? Now, just like Pendulum Magician establishing itself as the best deck of the format, True Draco's positioned itself as the second best deck of the format, and Masterpiece is a very big threat in its own right. The thing about Masterpiece is, it's a little bit different than with Pendulum Magician, because Pendulum Magician can establish multiple negations and it can be a little bit annoying for your deck to handle, but Masterpiece is a beast all on its own, because not only is it immune to multiple forms of disruption, but it also can disrupt you and stop you from advancing your game state in its own right. So any format that Masterpiece is a part of, especially when it's as prominent as it is in this format, it's something that you definitely have to consider. Now, obviously, there's ways to out Masterpiece depending on the type of deck that you're playing. If you're playing a rank 4 based deck, you have options like Utopia the Lightning. If you're playing a deck that could spam a bunch of monsters and link summon quite well, Borolo Dragon might be the option for you. Hell, take a deck like Dinosaur for instance. Dinosaur have a kaiju like Dogoron, and not only do you have Dogoron if you're playing a single copy, you have 3 copies of Soul Eating Overraptor, which can get to the Dogoron, but you also have 3 Fossil Dig, which can get to the Dogoron at the end point, which means you have 7 different ways to access a single kaiju, which in its own right outs Masterpiece. So it's a lot more consistent than just running 3 Gamma Seal in a deck, because you have multiple ways that are built-in engine components that your deck is already running to out that Masterpiece. And it doesn't really matter at that point, because then you're just going to basically drop Ultimate Conductor Tyranno on them and win, but being able to remove that Masterpiece is the priority in that instance, and analyzing how your deck can tackle these different problems is how you're going to start to look through the lens of a competitive player and start realizing that, maybe the deck you might have considered might not be the most ideal option. Now moving on to our third question, this is where we're going to start getting into some more generic questions as a whole that you should ask yourself, because in the specific format that we are currently in, there are a vast wide array of options that anyone could be playing. I think when you're in a much more defined and 10, maybe 2, 3, even 4 deck format like we were in previously with Spiral, Pendulum, Magician, and Trickstar, I think the questions you want to ask yourself should be more specific and tailored to those specific decks because you have a much more defined meta to work with. But in this current format, obviously Pendulum, Magician, and Draco are at the top, but after that, there are so many different decks that are viable in this current format that I think you need to look at what all of these decks have in common and kind of take a much broader approach when trying to tackle these issues. So getting on to our third question, how many disruptions is your deck able to establish? Now this is really important, and this is partially why Pendulum, Magician, and True Draco are the number 1 and 2 decks of this current format. Take Pendulum Magician for instance. Pendulum Magician is not only able to establish 2 to 3 negations, sometimes maybe even more, on turn 1, but it's able to do it consistently, and that's the key word here, consistency. If you have a deck that can establish, 4 or 5 different negations, and we see combo videos all the time on YouTube of a simple deck that can just do absolutely absurd things in turn 1 if it's playing solitaire. And while that may sound good in theory, if when you test the deck you're able to get that board 1 out of 10 times, but the other 9 out of 10 times you're only able to establish 1 negate, or maybe 2 negations if you're lucky, that's not consistent enough to go the distance in a competitive event. However, if you have a deck that can establish 2 to 3 negations and is able to do that over the course of 8 to 9 out of 10 games, you're gonna want that deck, and that sounds like a much better option just compared to being able to go off 1 in every 10 games, because you're gonna see much more consistent results, and that's what's going to translate into more wins for you. Because if you're able to deny your opponent being able to play by having disruptions for their turn, that means they're going to have less options to work with, and by simplifying that game state you already have control because you went first, that's how you're either going to control the board moving into the later stages of the game, or you're just going to flat out OTK them on the following turn, and it won't matter anyway because you secured yourself the win. Conversely, moving on to our fourth question, how many disruptions is your deck capable of playing through? Now, this pretty much just takes the third question and flips it on its head, because while it's important to be able to establish a strong board going first, if you have a deck that can do that, but can't play through negations going second, that's going to be a bit of a problem. Let's take, for instance, if you're looking down a Masterpiece, or if you're staring down a Macabre. If your deck is very incapable or having a difficult time of just dealing with one source of disruption, that's going to make your life a living hell, because not only are you going to have trouble just dealing with that one card, but then you're not going to be able to establish your own disruptions for when it's your opponent's turn again, and then you're just going to pretty much lose the tempo battle and just flat out lose the game inevitably. Now the thing is, when it comes to your opponent's disruptions and how many disruptions you have to play through, I want to separate this into 2 categories. You have known disruptions and you have unknown disruptions. So what are known disruptions? Well, these are things like I just mentioned. You have Invoked Macabre, you have Masterpiece, Vortex Dragon, Naruto, things that are on the field that are posing a threat in terms of being able to disrupt you, negate your cards, anything along those lines. That's very different than unknown threats such as hand traps. Now, the reason I say as unknown threats are much different, because hand traps can affect you if you're going first as well as if you're going second, because when you're going second, you already have a bunch of stuff you might have to deal with on the board. But in addition to that, you don't know what your opponent might have in their hand, and that's where things get very complicated. However, when you're going first, you usually have the initiative and have a lot of ability to have a lot of free range, but if your opponent has those hand traps, that can really dictate what your end board is going to be. And you really need to analyze how many negations can your deck play through. If your deck is able to establish, let's say, 3 or 4 negations or sources of disruption going first, that sounds really good. But let's say you get hit by an Ash Blossom, a Ghost Ogre, an Effect Veiler, a Psyframe Gear Gamma. Any of these hand traps can cripple a lot of different strategies, and if your board goes from 3 to 4 negations down to 0 after being hit by a single hand trap, that might not be the best option for you. There are some decks, when you start to look at how they're disrupted, they can actually play through these hand traps. They might not have as strong of boards, but having a board go from maybe 2 negations down to 1 negation just because you got hit by a hand trap seems like a pretty fair exchange, because rather than negating something else, it's like you relinquish that second disruption for one of your opponent's hand traps in a pretty fair 1-for-1. Now, obviously, you don't have the monster on the board still, so that matters a little bit. But ultimately, going from 2 to 1 isn't the end of the world. However, going from like 3 negations down to 0 at the cost of 1 hand trap is a very favorable exchange for your opponent and leaves you in a very vulnerable position to just flat out lose the game after getting hit by that hand trap. So that's something you really want to consider. You want to think about how, if you get hit by these hand traps, these unknown sources of disruption, what your end boards are going to look like, because that's just as important, if not more important, than your ultimate big wombo combo board that you can establish if your plays go unhindered. Now, this moves us on to our 5th and last question you should ask yourself. What does your deck do more unfairly than every other deck in the format? Take a look at Pendulum Magician. Not only does Pendulum Magician have the pendulum mechanic backing it, but it's able to consistently establish 2 to 3 negations going first almost every single game, and that seems really good. Look at True Draco. Not only does True Draco have Masterpiece backing it up, which is just one of the most oppressive cards in the game, but you also have multiple floodgates that your opponent has to deal with and brings down the ability for them to stop and pretty much disrupt your plays. And you can also run pretty much every powerful draw spell in the entire game unhindered. Look at the Invoked and the Trickstar decks. These are decks that have very small consistent engines and can run basically the remaining 2/3 of their deck cards that are going to be suited for taking down a specific meta. These are all things that these decks have and that they're played to their strengths, and these are why these decks shine, because they do something that's a little bit more unfair than other decks in the format. And that's why you're typically going to see these decks at the top tables or see these at the highest points in the meta, because usually the best decks in the game, they do something that's unfair, and that's okay, because every deck in the meta, or at least the top decks in the meta, they're gonna do things that are more unfair compared to their other decks. And that's cool, because it's kind of a battle to see what can do more unfair things, or do those unfair things consistently enough to just combat the opponent and start taking wins. So guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about, entering the competitive format as a whole, and any questions you should be asking yourself when it comes to doing that. But guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3, 4.